Every player who conquers Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, remembers the brutal difficulty, the punishing combat, the relentless enemy encounters. But there's another challenge lurking beneath the surface, one that's far more subtle and perhaps more significant. Zelda II's Hyrule feels empty. Not empty in the sense of lacking content, but empty in the sense of lacking life, history, and soul. The kingdom exists, but it doesn't breathe. The towns stand, but they don't tell stories. The landscapes stretch endlessly, but they whisper nothing about the civilization that supposedly inhabits them. This isn't just a flaw, it's a missing ingredient that reveals exactly what makes a game world feel alive versus merely functional. To understand what's absent from Zelda II, it helps to recognize what the original Legend of Zelda achieved with far fewer resources. Released in 1986 for the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System, the first Zelda game established environmental storytelling principles that would define the franchise. The overworld wasn't just a collection of screens, it was a landscape that suggested history, mystery, and purpose. Death Mountain dominated the northeast, its rocky terrain and dangerous enemies communicating that this was a place of ancient power and present danger. The Lost Woods created navigation puzzles through environmental design alone, teaching players that Hyrule's geography held secrets worth discovering. The graveyard in the northeast wasn't just an enemy spawn point, it was a thematic space, suggesting past conflicts and buried mysteries. The lakes and waterways implied ecosystems and natural geography. The scattered caves and hidden entrances rewarded exploration and suggested that Hyrule extended vertically as well as horizontally. Even the dungeon entrances communicated meaning through placement and visual design. Finding a dungeon mouth in the side of a mountain or hidden beneath a gravestone created narrative context before players even stepped inside. The world didn't need extensive dialogue or text dumps to feel lived in because the environment itself told stories. This environmental storytelling worked through visual language and spatial design. The original Zelda used sprite work and screen layout to communicate information non-verbally. A ring of stones suggested ancient ritual sites. Bombable walls indicated hidden construction. The placement of tougher enemies in specific regions taught players that Hyrule had geographical danger zones. Veterans of the game can still recall the exact layout of the overworld decades later because the space was designed to be memorable, meaningful, and rich with implied narrative. Zelda II abandons nearly all of this environmental storytelling infrastructure. The shift to a hybrid perspective, top-down overworld map with side-scrolling encounters and locations fundamentally altered how the world could communicate with players. The overworld map displays Hyrule as an abstraction, colored tiles representing terrain types, small sprites indicating Link's position and enemy locations, simple icons marking towns and palaces. This bird's-eye view of an entire kingdom sacrifices the ground-level detail that made the original game's world feel tangible. The towns in Zelda II demonstrate this void most clearly. 8 towns exist throughout Hyrule: Rauru, Ruto, Saria, Mido, Naboru, Darunia, New Kasuto, and Old Kasuto. Each town has a distinct layout of buildings, and some contain citizens who provide crucial information or services. On paper, this sounds like substantial world building. In execution, these towns feel like stage sets rather than communities. The buildings lack visual variation beyond basic shapes. There are no shops with displayed wares, no homes with visible details suggesting who lives there, no architectural flourishes indicating cultural identity or historical periods. The citizens themselves compound this emptiness. NPCs in Zelda II's towns stand in fixed positions inside buildings. Some offer vital information. I Am Error in Ruto provides one of gaming's most memorable accidental lines. Others teach magic spells or techniques essential for progression. A few demand payment before sharing knowledge, but none of them feel like people who exist beyond their functional role in Link's quest. There's no idle dialogue suggesting daily routines, no conversations between NPCs creating a sense of community, no visual storytelling through character placement or environmental details. Compare this to how later Zelda games approached town design. A Link to the Past's Kakariko Village, released just 4 years after Zelda II in 1991, features homes with distinct exteriors, citizens who move along paths, shops with visible inventory and personality, and environmental details like wells, gardens, and weather vanes that suggest a functioning community. The town exists vertically as well as horizontally, with multiple elevation levels creating spatial complexity. Citizens discuss rumors, complain about problems, and reference other locations, creating a web of connections that makes the world feel interconnected. Ocarina of Time elevated this further by giving NPCs routines, personalities expressed through text and character design, and architectural details that communicated cultural identity. Kakariko Village in that game features distinct housing styles, a graveyard with individually marked graves, a windmill with functional mechanics, and citizens whose dialogue changes based on time of day and story progression. The space tells stories about Sheikah history, about Dampe the Gravekeeper's eccentricities, about the relationship between the village and the royal family. Players learn about the world by inhabiting it, not just by reading dialogue. Zelda II's towns lack these layers. Buildings exist to house NPCs who serve specific functions. When those functions are fulfilled, there is no reason to return unless the player needs a specific service. The towns don't reward exploration with environmental details or optional interactions. They don't communicate culture, history, or social dynamics through visual design. They're quest dispensers arranged in town-shaped containers. The palaces and dungeons in Zelda II face similar challenges. While the level design within these structures demonstrates clever use of the side-scrolling perspective, requiring mastery of Link's combat abilities and careful resource management, the environments themselves remain visually generic. Stone corridors look similar across different palaces. The distinction between locations comes primarily from increased difficulty and specific item requirements rather than visual or thematic identity. Contrast this with the dungeons of the original Legend of Zelda, where each labyrinth had a distinct shape visible on the map screen, unique enemy compositions, and thematic elements suggested through tile sets and room layouts. The dungeons in Zelda II are certainly challenging and well-designed from a mechanical perspective, but they don't tell stories about what these places are, who built them, or why they exist in these specific locations. They're combat arenas and puzzle spaces, not ruins with implied histories. The overworld encounters present perhaps the starkest example of environmental storytelling absence. When Link touches an enemy sprite on the overworld map, the game transitions to a side-scrolling battle arena. These arenas feature terrain appropriate to the map region. Forests have trees, deserts have sand and cacti, grasslands have grass, but beyond these basic terrain indicators, the environments are functionally identical. There are no landmarks unique to specific regions, no ruins suggesting ancient battles, no variation in flora or geological features that might distinguish one forest from another or one desert from another. This creates a phenomenon where players can fight dozens of battles across hours of gameplay without forming any lasting memory of the spaces where combat occurred. The battles themselves might be memorable for their difficulty or specific enemy combinations, but the locations blur together. This stands in sharp contrast to games where specific battle locations become memorable because of unique environmental features. Players remember specific screens in the original Zelda not just because of the enemies present, but because of how those enemies interacted with the terrain and visual elements of that screen. The lack of environmental storytelling extends to how Zelda II presents its narrative context. The game's backstory is substantial. Link must awaken Princess Zelda from an ancient sleeping curse by placing crystals in 6 palaces and retrieving the Triforce of Courage from the Great Palace. This curse dates back generations and involves tragedy, royal succession, and the misuse of power. It's compelling lore that explains Link's motivation and the kingdom's current state. The problem is that almost none of this narrative appears within the game world itself. The backstory exists primarily in the game manual, with some additional information provided by NPCs who deliver exposition through text boxes. But the world itself doesn't reflect this history. There are no visual indicators of the ancient tragedy that befell the kingdom, no shrines or monuments suggesting how past generations remembered these events, no architectural details indicating that Hyrule has a long history with moments of prosperity and crisis. This creates a disconnect between narrative and environment. The game tells players that they're exploring a kingdom with a rich and tragic history, but the world they traverse suggests no such depth. Palaces exist without context about who built them or when. Towns show no signs of age, development, or historical layers. The landscape itself could be 10 years old or 10,000 years old. There's no visual language communicating temporal depth. Later Zelda games understood that environmental storytelling requires embedding narrative into the world's visual fabric. Ocarina of Time shows Hyrule Castletown as a prosperous community in the past and a burning ruin in the future, letting players see the consequences of failure through environmental change.
Majora's Mask uses Clocktown's architecture and citizen behavior to tell stories about Terminus culture and the impending apocalypse's psychological impact. The Wind Waker's scattered islands contain ruins of a drowned kingdom, with broken towers and submerged structures telling stories about the world that once existed. Breath of the Wild represents the culmination of this philosophy, creating a Hyrule where environmental storytelling is paramount. Ruined villages communicate where communities once thrived. Guardian corpses mark ancient battlefields. Broken weapons and charred terrain show where the calamity struck. The landscape itself is the primary narrator, with dialogue and text serving to supplement what players discover through exploration. The world feels lived in because it's designed to show the marks of habitation, conflict, and time. Zelda II's environmental emptiness has gameplay implications beyond just atmosphere. When a world lacks visual and narrative landmarks, navigation becomes more challenging in ways that aren't necessarily rewarding. Players must rely heavily on the map screen to track their position and destination because the world itself provides insufficient navigational cues. There's no follow the river north until you see the ancient bridge, then head east toward the Twin Peaks, because the world doesn't have those kinds of memorable features. Backtracking and exploration feel less rewarding when the world doesn't hide environmental details to discover on return visits. In games with rich environmental storytelling, returning to familiar areas often reveals new details now that players know more context or have new abilities to access previously unreachable spaces. Zelda II's world is largely static. What players see on the first visit is what they'll see on the 10th visit. The exception is when players acquire items or abilities that allow access to previously blocked palaces or areas, but these are mechanical gates rather than environmental revelations. This affects player motivation in subtle but significant ways. Exploration in games is often driven by curiosity about what exists beyond the next corner or over the next hill. When the world itself is visually and narratively sparse, that curiosity has less to feed on. Players explore primarily to find the next objective marker, rather than to satisfy wonder about the world itself. The journey becomes about reaching destinations rather than experiencing the space between them. The difficulty design in Zelda II might partially explain this environmental austerity. The game is notably challenging, with tough enemies, limited resources, and punishing death penalties. In this context, making the world visually and narratively complex might have felt like a distraction from the core challenge. The developers may have intentionally kept environments simple to maintain focus on combat and progression systems. If players are constantly fighting for survival, elaborate environmental details might go unnoticed anyway. However, this reasoning has limitations. Many challenging games feature rich environmental storytelling precisely because it provides context and motivation for the difficulty. Dark Souls is punishingly difficult, but features intricate environmental design that tells stories about the world's history, the civilizations that rose and fell, and the cosmic significance of the player's struggle. The difficulty feels meaningful because the world explains why this place is so dangerous and what's at stake. Environmental storytelling and mechanical challenge can coexist productively. The technical constraints of the NES cannot be ignored as factors in Zelda II's environmental design. Memory limitations restricted how much visual variety could exist within the game. Creating distinct tile sets for every town and palace required cartridge space that might have been allocated to other systems. The side-scrolling perspective demanded more sprites and animation frames for Link and enemies compared to the overhead view, potentially limiting resources available for environmental detail. Yet, other NES games demonstrated that rich environmental storytelling was possible within these constraints. Castlevania, released in 1986, used background details, architectural variety, and atmospheric elements to create a castle that felt ancient and haunted, despite limited graphical capabilities. Metroid, also from 1986, designed alien environments with distinct visual identities that communicated the planet Zeeb's strange ecology and ancient technology. These games prove that technical limitations don't automatically preclude environmental storytelling. They just require prioritizing it during development. The fascinating aspect of Zelda II's environmental emptiness is how it influenced future Zelda games, likely by demonstrating what not to do. A Link to the Past, developed for the more capable Super Nintendo, lavished attention on environmental detail. Kakariko Village, the Lost Woods, Death Mountain, Lake Hylia, the Desert of Mystery, each region had distinct visual identity, suggested history through environmental design, and rewarded exploration with secrets embedded in the landscape. The light and dark world mechanic allowed the same geography to tell two different stories, depending on which realm players occupied. This focus on environmental richness became a franchise hallmark. Every subsequent Zelda game invested heavily in creating worlds that communicated story through space, architecture, and visual detail. Even when games reused the top-down perspective of early entries, they filled that perspective with environmental storytelling absent from Zelda II. Link's Awakening created Koholint Island as a dreamlike space where every location had personality and narrative significance. The Oracle games designed Holodrum and Labrina with regional diversity and environmental secrets. The 3D Zelda games especially benefited from lessons learned. Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field, while sometimes criticized for emptiness, still featured Lon Lon Ranch as a central landmark, scattered trees and fences suggesting agricultural use, and distant views of other regions creating anticipation. Each major region, Kokiri Forest, Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, Gerudo Desert, had unmistakable visual and architectural identity. Players could identify where they were instantly based on environmental cues alone. Majora's Mask took this further by making environmental storytelling central to the experience. Clocktown's 4 districts each reflected different aspects of Termina's culture. The swamp region's decay mirrored the poisoning of the Deku Palace. Snowhead's perpetual winter reflected the mechanical disruption of natural cycles. The Great Bay's murky waters showed ecosystem collapse. Ikana Canyon's ruins told stories about a kingdom that destroyed itself through pride and war. Every environment was narratively charged. Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword continued this tradition, creating spaces where architecture, terrain features, and environmental details communicated lore and history. Even Triforce Heroes, despite its multiplayer focus, designed levels with visual personality and thematic coherence. The franchise had internalized that Zelda worlds must feel inhabited and meaningful, not just functional. Breath of the Wild represents the apotheosis of this philosophy. Every corner of that Hyrule tells stories. Ruined guardians mark where the final battle lines were drawn. Abandoned villages show where communities fled during the calamity. Ancient shrines demonstrate Sheikah technological achievement. Regional architecture reflects cultural identities. Rito structures emphasize verticality. Zora architecture integrates water. Gerudo buildings use desert-appropriate materials. The landscape itself bears scars and beauty that communicate history without a single line of dialogue. This evolution makes Zelda II's environmental emptiness more striking in retrospect. The game exists as an outlier, an experiment that explored different priorities. Its mechanical innovations, the experience point system, the side-scrolling combat, the magic system, influenced future games in limited ways, but its environmental approach was largely rejected by subsequent entries, which universally moved toward richer, more detailed, more narratively embedded worlds. Does this make Zelda II a failure? Not remotely. The game accomplished what it set out to achieve, creating a challenging action RPG experience within the Zelda framework. It demonstrated that the franchise could survive dramatic mechanical reinvention. It cultivated a devoted fan base that appreciates its unique identity. For players who value difficulty, combat depth, and mechanical challenge above environmental storytelling, Zelda II delivers exactly what they seek. But for players whose love of Zelda centers on exploration, discovery, and the sense of inhabiting a world with depth and history, Zelda II's emptiness is palpable. The kingdom exists as a stage for Link's quest, rather than as a place with independent reality. The towns serve mechanical functions, rather than suggesting communities with culture and continuity. The landscape facilitates travel rather than inviting contemplation about what makes this land worth saving. This absence highlights something crucial about game world design. Functionality isn't sufficient for immersion. A world can be perfectly playable, every system working as intended, every location accessible, every challenge balanced, and still feel hollow if it doesn't communicate that it exists beyond the player's immediate experience. The best game worlds suggest that life continues when players aren't present, that history accumulated before their arrival, that the space has meaning independent of their role within it. Zelda II's Hyrule feels lifeless because it's designed entirely around the player. NPCs exist to give Link information or teach him abilities. Palaces exist for Link to conquer. Towns exist to service Link's needs. There's no suggestion of a world that functions according to its own logic, with its own rhythms, independent of the hero's quest. Everything is in service to gameplay progression rather than world coherence. Modern game design recognizes this distinction and actively works to create worlds that feel self-sustaining. NPC schedules give the impression that characters have lives beyond their interaction with the player. Environmental details that serve no mechanical purpose suggest that designers created a place rather than just a level. Lore scattered throughout the environment invites players to piece together histories that contextualize their quest.
These elements require development resources that could be spent on other systems, but they're prioritized because they're recognized as essential to creating compelling worlds. The irony is that Zelda II's environmental emptiness may have taught Nintendo more valuable lessons than if the game had succeeded in this area. By experiencing what a Zelda world feels like without rich environmental storytelling, the development teams for subsequent games understood viscerally why that storytelling mattered. The contrast between Zelda II's functional but hollow Hyrule and the vibrant, detailed Hyrule of A Link to the Past couldn't be starker, and that contrast surely influenced design philosophy going forward. In this sense, Zelda II's lifeless world served a crucial role in the franchise's evolution. It demonstrated through absence what previous games had achieved through presence. It showed that mechanical innovation alone couldn't compensate for environmental barrenness in a series defined by exploration and discovery. It proved that Zelda needed worlds that felt alive, not just playable. The game's legacy is thus paradoxical. As a playable experience, it represents a bold departure that some players cherish and others struggle with. As a lesson in world design, it represents a cautionary tale that shaped how Nintendo approached environment building in every subsequent Zelda title. The emptiness wasn't intentional failure, it was the natural result of prioritizing other aspects of game design within severe constraints. But that choice created a unique experience that some players value precisely for its stark, challenging emptiness. But it also created a void that every subsequent Zelda game has worked to fill, with details, with stories, with evidence of life and history and meaning. in teaching Nintendo what Zelda worlds lack when they're designed purely around functionality. Zelda II paradoxically helped the franchise understand what its worlds need to feel fully alive. The Ghost of Hyrule taught future developers how to breathe life into kingdoms, and in doing so, earned its place in the series' evolution, even as it remains the emptiest kingdom Link has ever traversed.